Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Scott Timke, and today I'm going to be speaking about what might otherwise be called platforms for imperial finance. More than half a century after Kwame Nkrumah first articulated his magisterial critique of neocolonialism, this critique remains just as relevant for the analysis of present-day algorithmic capitalism in Africa. The present convergence of finance and wireless technology has generated considerable enthusiasm in development circles about the promise of connectivity in fintech to improve quality of life and create wealth on the African continent. The prototypical example that proponents point to is M-Pesa, a service run in Kenya by Safaricom. Launched in 2007, M-Pesa is a form of mobile banking which uses cell phone accounts as a financial service, permitting transfers and credit extension facilities. Initially funded by the United Kingdom's DFID, the service was commercialized through a joint venture by Vodafone and Safaricom. By 2019, there were 30 million customers and 6 billion yearly transactions. By most estimates, the service is a success. This presentation revisits that conclusion by asking how these kinds of fintech technologies, in their current configuration, perpetuate neo-colonial relations. Replacing direct military rule, neo-colonial relations can be understood as a coordinated exploitation of developing countries by advanced capitalist ones through their clout in the international political economy. If such a claim at first appears like a stretch, because it appears conspiratorial, it is worth recalling how European imperial and colonial practices were naturalized and normalized for most of modernity. While the methods of neo-colonialists are subtle and varied, let's begin with the obvious. Desires to bring Africa online in the 2000s had to confront stark realities born from first, the legacies of colonial infrastructure planned primarily to support resource extraction or settler communities, and second, IMF-imposed structural adjustment policies that slashed state maintenance budgets and social and economic political infrastructures. So when digital neo-modernization advocates maintain that without access to the internet, people in the global south will face a digital divide, thereby exacerbating poverty that stemmed from the already asymmetrical relations in the global system, they overlook the very history that gave rise to those inequalities and deficiencies in the first place. So this rhetoric of digital inclusion tends to overlook the historical materialist method at the heart of discussions about digital inequalities. Indeed, the connectivity paradigm currently promoted by the World Economic Forum and Facebook focuses on building infrastructure to create markets and customers which by ordinary operation will bridge the digital divide, supposedly. However, this conceptualization ignores the insights of the scholarship around uneven and combined development, or the research on the spatial fix required by capitalism to stall social problems in metropoles. In other words, for their discussion about connectivity, when digital neo-modernizers deny the connections of history, they deny how some polities are rich because others are poor. Take the case of rising household over-indebtedness mediated by micro-lending platforms like M-Pesa. Sociological studies of the working class in Kenya, like that done by Kevin Donovan and Emma Park, demonstrate how these digitally mediated financial markets create debt traps for this class. In effect, their earnings go to pay off debts, and more loans are taken against future earnings to service existing debts. This digitally mediated indebtedness of the working class is facilitated by a combination of the increase of volume of rents extracted in the modern financial economy, as well as, crucially, the analysis of user-generated information to assess the creditworthiness. In short, social reproduction is articulated through the logic of this financial system, in turn causing severe maldistribution. Through this employment of fintech, poverty is a new frontier for profit-making. These are the kinds of processes that Don Cartier and Abedel Bradine have in mind when they write about data orientalism and the algorithmic colonization of Africa, respectively. While there is an excellent critical literature on fintech, and it is growing, too often that work is lost in the analytical and political noise of neo-modernization. As the connectivity paradigm illustrates, this ideology has a naive comprehension of technology as a social form. By contrast, when approached from a critical perspective, fintech is not confined to simply reconfiguring or extending new services. Rather, it involves creating new markets, introducing new machinery to reduce labor costs, and more generally aid in intersector competition. But most importantly, fintech is concerned with enclosing and capturing the value in existing informal lending practices that the African working class has already built for themselves. For example, South African informal saving networks are estimated to hold up to $3 billion US. To put it another way, the purpose of fintech is to readjust the balance of power between capital and labor. This means that the central issue is not about the outcomes this technology produces, nor is it even a matter of access. The fundamental question is about how control rights of this technology reside with a minority of shareholders and how the interests are adjacent to the interests of the firm's customers. And through indebtedness, fintech is effectively creating a digital creditor-debtor divide in Africa. There is considerable value in revisiting Nkrumah's neocolonialism to understand the neocolonial components of algorithmic capitalism in Africa. Published in 1965 and written in the wake of British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's 1960s Winds of Change speech in the Parliament of South Africa, in which the Conservative British government signalled that they would no longer oppose independence movements. Neocolonialism, as Nkrumah described it, was a technique of indirect rule kept in place through a combination of economic arrangements and treaties, innovations in communication technologies, and with the assistance of local sympathetic agents. In short, Nkrumah argued that European politicians like Macmillan and Charles de Gaulle offered disingenuous statements about the formal end of colonial rule, in part because newer mechanisms of colonial exploitation were now possible to implement. As a quick illustration of the durability of neocolonialism as a form of imperial rule, consider how 60 years after formal political independence, the CFA franc has kept former French colonies under the influence of France's monetary policy, and how France is able to structure the economic relationship between themselves and their former colonies. In the most recent book, Africa's Last Colonial Currency, 162 million people in 15 states have France mediate their monetary policy. When paired with frequent military interventions that still take place, as Nkrumah accounted for, African populations continue to be the subjects of scientific and financial experimentation by global powers. Even reviewing Nkrumah's sequence of chapters gives an early indication of the larger argumentations and stakes of his thesis. To quote him, exercised through economic or monetary means and by a consortium of financial interests, end quote, imperialist finances and its currencies enable capitalists to establish corporations dedicated to extracting raw materials from concessions. By pressing labor, whose wages are artificially depressed through monopoly and monopoly, the profits are then repatriated to metropoles through monetary zones and foreign banks. Indeed, at the time the book even caught the eye of the CIA, who in November of 1965 wrote a book review on it, describing it as a threat to American power on the continent. Nkrumah's government would not last even 4 more months. It was deposed in February 1966 by a military coup. While it is difficult to adequately discuss Ghanaian politics in the 1960s in its venue, and more generally we must resist monocausal explanations, it is nevertheless telling that Nkrumah's removal set in motion a diplomatic realignment that benefited the West. It is this kind of protracted material struggle between oppressor and oppressed that gave rise to neocolonial critique. In a 1989 edition of the Black Jacobins, C.L. James included an appendix called From Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro, in which he writes about the intellectual encounter between West Indians like Marcus Garvey and George Padmore, and Africans like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah. Calling it one of the strangest stories in a period of history, James described how encounters between sets of migrants in European cities led to the formation of groups like the International African Service Bureau, that Theo Williams has written about in other venues. Being in metropoles, these Pan-Africans had front row seats to witness the transition from the old colonial system, the one that had stood since the 1884-85 Congress of Berlin Conference, to neo-colonialism that emerged after World War II. Through their criticism of the weapon, to employ a line from Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, that Pan-Africanists made their theory a material force. While there are several tendencies in African studies, neocolonialism and neo-modernization represent two divergent conceptualizations of actions occurring on the continent. Despite protestations otherwise, neo-modernization is institutionally, philanthropically, and academically entrenched. It provides the initial frame of reference for the design of empirical studies, and it is precisely because they have already established a near monopoly on what is written about the subject, to enroll some of Walter Rodney's remarks, the space is made for neo-colonial critique. This critique can, for example, show how local intermediaries facilitate neo-colonial rule. Rodney called these local agents allegiance to, or sine qua cooperation with, neo-colonial powers part of the elementary conditions of neo-colonial rule. For example, as it applies to algorithmic capitalism, the Kenyan government owns 35% of Safaricom. This means that the state gains revenues from the indebtedness of its citizens and the commodification of their data. But here arises a contradiction, because these revenues may be offset by costs spent to address the social consequences of indebtedness, like homelessness, gender-based violence, mental illness. Indeed, depending upon their mandate, parts of the Kenyan bureaucracy are likely working at cross purposes from another. This adds conflicting interests to any intergovernmental discussions about how or if to regulate lending apps like M-Pesa. There's another complexity to this too, and that is through Vodacom, which the South African government owns a portion of. Effectively, the South African government is gaining revenue from the indebtedness of the Kenyan working class too. So despite the rhetoric of an African Renaissance or similar, the actions on the ground, the balance sheets, speak differently. To recap, aside from the skews and parameters that arise from internal properties, it is true that there's nothing intrinsically exploitative about digital technology. That said, due to the global supremacy of the private property regime, the meaning and operation of these digital infrastructures is overdetermined by capitalist values. Accordingly, using neocolonialism and studies of digital sociology can help us focus less on the mechanisms of this or that platform and more on how platforms are part of the basic forms of society that shape social relations. In this vein, neocolonialism provides a different methodology, a counter-narrative, if we want to use Paul Gilroy's term, that foregrounds the experience of the oppressed. And this counter-narrative comes to vastly different conclusions to the ones proposed by neo-modernizers that happen to exist in the elite fintech philanthropy development complex. This complex promotes platforms to advance economic liberalization and to skirt existing regulations, believing that such policy courses can nominally improve material conditions for Africans. However, in practice, due to platform-mediated financialization setting up conditions of perpetual insolvency, the lived experience of the African working class is delimited by the interests of metropolitan capital, an arrangement that is reminiscent of the same kinds of subordination that Nkrumah described in the latter half of the 20th century. And much like in the 20th century before, this most recent iteration of neocolonialism will have long reverberations. Thank you for listening.